Welcome back to Outside Views, and bro, we need to talk. And this is a topic that sits right at the intersection of history, identity, and raw political blunder. We are talking today about the uncomfortable, undeniable ghost haunting the entire Brexit project, and that is the British Empire. Was Brexit just a trade negotiation, or was it a desperate, nostalgic reach back to a glorious past that simply no longer exists? And my view is simple. You cannot understand the fury, the drive, or the sheer self-destructive impulse of Brexit without recognizing the shadow of the empire. And I don't mean Palpatine. It looms over the whole disaster, coloring the national self-perception in ways that are deeply misleading and ultimately harmful. For those who argued for leaving the European Union, the underlying message was not just about control, but about destiny. It was the belief that Britain, a nation that once ruled a quarter of the globe, did not need partners. It only needed the freedom to strike out alone and reclaim its proper place. They called it Global Britain, but what they were really describing was Empire 2.0. And this time I also don't mean Kylo Ren. And they were projecting a fantasy onto the world stage, one where the UK could pivot seamlessly from a continental power to a global trading hub, held together by the threadbare emotional ties of the Commonwealth. But the truth is, the world moved on. The empire is gone. And the feelings of the British people toward this past are incredibly complex, often contradictory, and sometimes deeply misguided. Surveys and reports in recent years consistently show a significant and frankly startling level of nostalgia for the empire. A substantial number of Britons express pride in the colonial past, often focusing on perceived benefits like infrastructure and trade, while simultaneously downplaying or simply being unaware of the atrocities, the exploitation, and the violence inherent in the colonial project. This selective memory is not accidental. It's a profound failure of the national education system and public discourse. It has allowed a sanitized, golden-tinted version of history to persist, which then becomes a potential and potent political tool. It creates a distorted self-image, the image of a great, moral, powerful nation whose exceptionalism is not something to strive for, but something already earned and inherent. And this self-perception is the bedrock upon which the entire Brexit vote was built. When a nation believes it is uniquely equipped to stand alone, it becomes less receptive to the mundane, complicated reality of interdependence. The European Union, with its shared sovereignty, its complex compromises, and its emphasis on consensus, was fundamentally incompatible with this lingering imperial mindset. The EU demanded that Britain be a partner, but a segment of the British identity, fueled by imperial mythology, only accepted the role of a leader, or failing that, an isolated sovereign. The language used during the referendum campaign was thick with imperial echoes. The idea of taking back control was a direct linguistic descendant of a power structure where the UK controlled vast territories and populations. It suggested that control was something external that had been stolen, rather than a necessary function of modern cooperative governance that had been shared. The promise of striking new, exciting global trade deals was another ghost of empire. It evoked a past when London was the center of a global network of controlled markets, trading freely, but on its own terms, with countries compelled to cooperate. The reality of post-Brexit trade, however, has been less global and more friction. Trade with the European single market, the nearest, largest and most crucial trading partner, has become complicated, expensive and bureaucratic. The trade deals struck far away, like the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, while symbolically important, offer only marginal economic uplift compared to the damage done to the Continental Partnership. And this is the brutal economic reckoning of nostalgia. They traded easy access to a 17 trillion euro economic bloc for marginal gains with distant partners, all because the emotional pull of globalism was louder than the pragmatic reality of proximity. And this is where the ghost truly becomes destructive. The proponents of this move generally believed that the Commonwealth nations would immediately step up to replace the EU market. And this belief system stemmed directly from the imperial fantasy that these former colonies still felt the gravitational pull of London and would prioritize sentiment over hard economic self-interest. And the reality? India, Australia, and Canada are rightly focused on their own strategic interests and their own trade deals, often with giant, fast-growing partners in the Pacific. The idea that the UK could simply walk back into a position of dominance in these relationships was a form of post-imperial delusion. The empire's legacy is also deeply entwined with a persistent and harmful sense of exceptionalism. This is the belief that because of its history, its role in 2 world wars, its language, its political model, the UK plays by different rules. And this exceptionalism made it difficult to accept the reality that in the 21st century, the UK is a medium-sized European power whose influence is maximized through multilateral cooperation, not unilateral grandstanding. The refusal to fully embrace the European project, always maintaining a distance, always demanding opt-outs, was a continuous expression of this exceptional identity, a refusal to fully shed the skin of the imperial past. When the pressure came, that latent exceptionalism exploded into the political decision to leave. It was not a calculated economic move. It was an emotional assertion of distinctiveness. The problem with the empire, both historically and as a political ghost, is its failure to reckon with its own morality. The historical record is clear on the violence, the massacres, the famines, and the systemic racial subjugation that underpinned British rule. The recent surge in pride toward the empire, as noted in the research, is often correlated with a low awareness of these historical facts. When a nation is not prepared to confront the dark side of its past, and this is a German here speaking, it remains very vulnerable to having that past weaponized for political gain. The Brexit campaign successfully tapped into the emotional residue of this unexamined history. It was a feeling, not a spreadsheet. It offered a return to a time when Britain was supposedly strong and independent, a time before it was shackled by continental bureaucracy. The use of the monarchy, the flag, and other symbols during the campaign were all carefully calculated nods to a collective memory where Britain stood proudly and victoriously alone. But we must ask, what kind of future can be built on a deliberate misremembering of the past? What kind of economic policy is sound when it's driven by a nostalgic fantasy? The answer, as the economic data increasingly shows, is a poor one. The consequences of the rupture, the loss of easy access to skills, the increased costs for businesses, the chilling effect on investment, are the direct price of that self-inflicted isolation. The UK is now engaged in a struggle to define itself without the crutches of either the empire or the EU. The empire provided the myth of global destiny. The EU provided the practical framework for modern European life. By rejecting the latter in a desperate attempt to resurrect the former, the UK has created a profound void. The promise of global Britain remains an aspiration without a credible plan, reliant on bilateral deals that will never replace the scale and depth of the single market. The UK's future success lies not in rediscovering an imperial destiny, but in accepting its place as a leading, but not exceptional nation within Europe and the wider world. It requires maturity, humility, and the painful process of finally decolonizing the national mind. It requires acknowledging that the days of commanding continents are over, and that influence is now gained through collaboration, not domination. Until that reckoning is fully faced, until the historical baggage is truly unpacked and understood in its painful complexity, the UK will continue to make choices driven by the ghost of a past that prevents a successful future. Britain was less about economics or immigration and far more about a deep-seated identity crisis, a spasm of imperial nostalgia in face of modern complexity. It was a tragic attempt to use a vote to turn back the clock, to deny the loss of empire, and to cling to the comforting lie of a unique and powerful destiny. And that, in my view, is the greatest tragedy of the whole affair. So thank you for joining me on Outside Views, and let me hear your thoughts on my thoughts. And if you want to see another video right now, the next one is right here in the end screen. I'll see you there. I'll be back.